It is officially that time of year. Pitchers and catchers are reporting, and for the first time this spring training, David Stearns met with the media today, and he had a lot to say. We're going to break it all down on today's edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. Chris Schubert, Jack McKessie, back with you once again to play a little pop psychologist. We're going to try to read between the lines of what Mets president of baseball operations David Stearns had to say today when he met with the media. Jack, how are you, my friend? We are moving closer to the beginning of the baseball season.
I'm doing great, Chris. It's the time of year with anticipation reaching all-time highs. I cannot wait for spring training games to start. I am looking forward to this podcast as well, this episode where we break down all of the GM speak that David Stearns said today and try to decipher some of the actual meaning behind those words. But before we get into anything crazy, I just want to shout out our YouTube channel right now. We have video versions of every episode of the podcast up on YouTube. So hello, everybody, if you're watching right now. And if you're not, you can go over to youtube.com, look up Jack McKessie. That's McKessy. And you can catch every episode that we record of this podcast in video format if you prefer it that way. So be sure to tune in, like, subscribe, leave a comment. I read all of them, and I tell Chris about all of them as well. So we'd love getting any feedback we can on the video side. And if you have any notes for the audio or for what we're talking about, that's also great to hear from you as well.
We also want you to hear about BetOnline, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion with the largest selection of odds on everything from the NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC. BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here. I want to tell a bit of a story here to start this episode of the pod because I consumed a lot of David Stearns media today because I started my day. My friend Jack McKessie sent me a text message, and it was a YouTube link. And it was a YouTube link to a 50-minute video that saw David Stearns sit down with Pablo Torre over with the Dan Le Batard show. And Pablo Torre finds out, and they went to Harvard together. They covered Harvard sports together for the Harvard school newspaper. So they've been buddies for over 20 years. And it was a really cool watch of David Stearns kind of explaining his path, explaining his career, explaining his day-to-day operational type stuff. It was a really cool look behind the scenes for David Stearns. Now, lucky for me, I watch everything and listen to everything at least 1.75 speed. So a 50-minute video for me, I got through that thing in about 25 minutes, half hour. It was no big deal. But then we had David Stearns' first press conference as spring training is getting underway across Major League Baseball. So a lot of David Stearns for me to unpack. I hopefully will not connect between the two. I will not cross over between the two things. If I do, Jack, you'll have to stop me. But I think what is so interesting about David Stearns and the way he handles himself when he meets with the media, at least in my opinion, is he says a lot without actually saying a lot. He does a lot of GM speak, but you're able to understand the GM speak. There's a message behind what he's saying. Sometimes you'll get GM or coach speak where it's literally nothing. You can't decode it for anything. There's little breadcrumbs with David Stearns about his philosophy, about the way the Mets are handling themselves. I thought the way he answered some of the Pete questions gave you those breadcrumbs. And then there was an answer that you wanted to talk about pitching that I think he also left some breadcrumbs there as well. So I will kick it over to you, and you can start and take us whatever direction, whatever you thought was the most important thing from today's media availability.
Yeah, so today was kind of just a almost recap of the offseason rather than looking ahead to spring training too much, although he did touch a little bit on how he sees this version of the roster, this version of the Mets in 2025. Most of this was a look back on the recent moves of signing Pete, signing Jesse Winker, and AJ Minter after the reports that they were pivoting, looking back at what he thought of Steve Cohen's comments at Amazing Day that we touched on in an earlier episode of this pod. But one of the biggest things that I took away from this was what he had to say about the pitching market, as well as some of the moves the Mets made. So before I get ahead of myself here, some quick news. Along with the Pete Alonso signing, obviously, that we discussed last episode. The Mets today on Wednesday,
It's
February
Wednesday,
12th,
yeah, Wednesday. Yeah.
the Mets signed Drew Smith to a 2-year deal with it's a 1-year deal with a club out option after 2025. So
it's a 2-year deal. It's a 2-year deal.
2-year deal. They're essentially planning on, from what we gather, maybe having him pitch at the very end of the season or just taking on his contract to add to the bullpen in 2026. Obviously, provided that they like how the medicals are looking and how he's progressed from his Tommy John surgery. But that kind of fell into the bucket of some of the big takeaways that I had from David Stearns at this press conference, which were just some status updates and their perspective on 3 pitchers in specific that might or might not have the ability to contribute to the team in 2025. Drew Smith was the first one, or kind of the primary one, because he was the more recent news with the signing today. He said, we're not going to rush it with Drew Smith. Kind of what I was just saying. They're leaving the door open for like a September return for him, but they're not going to force the issue if they feel like they're in a good place. And
I took that as, if he's going to pitch, it'll be in September, but they're not going into the year expecting him to pitch. That it was basically a primer of, he's probably sitting out all of 2025. If you see him, it'll be in September, but don't bet on it. That was the way I inferred the way he phrased it.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as well. Like, if he does pitch, also, it's not going to be in any high leverage stuff. I don't expect him to be on the postseason roster by any means, but it'd be nice if we saw Drew Smith. Obviously missed almost all of last season after tearing that UCL, but we'll see. And then the other big update, that's probably the second biggest update of the 3 pitchers that he mentioned, was Christian Scott. Obviously made his debut halfway through last season before also needing to undergo Tommy John. I think he also underwent the surgery in like August or September. So we already kind of knew that he probably wasn't going to pitch this year. David Stearns confirmed that today. He's just straight up 2026 is the plan for him. And then Adbert Alzolay, who was I believe, minor league contract signing by the Mets earlier this offseason, is not expected to pitch in 2025 either. He will fully be a 2026 plan for the Mets. And then there's just one more thing on the pitching side, Chris, that Stearns touched on. And I think this is kind of the bigger story or more meaty, substantive comment that we can maybe discuss a little bit more here. A quote from Stearns saying, "We pursued pitchers on long-term deals, but not at values that secured them for us." So you think about guys like the Corbin Burnses, the Max Frieds. We talked last episode, or maybe 2 episodes ago, about how the Mets this offseason have not signed any player to longer than a 3-year deal, other than, Juan Soto.
Juan Soto. Yeah, Juan Soto being the exception to that rule, yeah.
But it's interesting to hear from Stearns that they were willing to hand out some longer-term contracts, but it was going to be on their own terms. And in other words, they were not going to hand out any of the high AAV and long-term deals that, the guys like Max Fried and Corbin Burns and Blake Snell did end up getting. But I don't know. I thought that was an interesting insight into Stearns' philosophy, because we've talked several times about how he doesn't like giving out these long-term deals to older pitchers, but it turns out he would have been comfortable if it were at the right price point.
Yeah, I think David Stearns has been very steadfast in his belief of, we will entertain anything. We will explore everything. We have certain principles that we adhere to. We have certain, overall guidelines that most of these things are going to fall into, but there's always an exception. And I already know that I'm cross-referencing the Pablo Torre thing that I watched earlier today. So this one I know for sure. But when he was talking on that podcast about Juan Soto and signing Juan Soto, he made it very clear of the reason why this was a 15-year, $765 million deal is you basically, in baseball, get one player like this that hits free agency with still their prime in front of them once every 10 years. Like, you have one chance at this. I thought that kind of threw some cold water on this idea of Vlad getting this big mega deal from the Mets next year. He basically said that you can't really do this all the time. You can't have more than one of these. But I think overall the principle is, we believe that most of the time when we get to free agency, these players are past their prime. So we're not going to pay them prime numbers. But when a Juan Soto becomes available, we are going to explore that to its fullest, because these situations don't come up every so often. And if you're going to take the swing, you better take the swing. And so I think that it's incredibly consistent with what they've believed. And look up and down what happened this offseason. The Mets were never going to give Blake Snell 5 years, $182 million. It's just never going to happen. They're not going to pay a 32-year-old until he's 37. It's just not the way David Stearns is going to operate. Now, if Blake Snell wanted to do more of what UC Kikuchi did, 363, I think he would have been interested in that, right? I think that's more in line with what the Mets are trying to do, but they were never going to give Corbin Burns 6 years, $210 million. It just wasn't going to happen. If a player's deal, if Corbin Burns' market reflected more of how Jordan Montgomery's market developed last year, the short-term high AAV deal, boom, Corbin Burns would have been a Met. So
For sure.
the idea of a older than 30 pitcher ending up on the Mets, it's possible, but it just has to be under the right terms. And guess what? We saw that. Sean Manaea was not going to come back to the New York Mets if he wanted a fourth year. Was not going to happen. But they came to a framework that worked for both sides, and they got the deal done. So I think that was a real big takeaway for me. And then to your point about the Drew Smith stuff, we call a lot of things on this podcast the David Stearns special, but it's the David Stearns special. I'm going to sign a guy who's rehabbing. I'm going to have a club option for next year, so he's basically 2 years. I'm going to pay him to rehab with us, and then next year I'm going to have a relatively cheap option in-house for my bullpen. David Stearns loves this market, loves it. I mean, this is where you talk about finding those edges and finding those bargains. David Stearns wants to have like 7 or 8 of these guys every offseason. You want to rehab? I'll sign you to a 2-year deal or a 1-year deal with a club option, and then I get your after rehab year at a cheap price. Yeah, I'm absolutely going to do it. And so that's what he loves it. It's a David Stearns blue light special at Kmart. It's a David Stearns special. Get me a reliever on a 1-year deal with a club option. I'll let you rehab. Don't pitch for a year. Boom. I'm going to have, they're paying Drew Smith $1 million to rehab. The club option for next year is $2 million. Can you imagine if Drew Smith is anywhere near his potential next year for like $2 million? Could you imagine the value that the Mets bullpen is going to have for $2 million?
That'd be nice. I mean, you never know when a pitcher's coming back from an injury like this, how exactly they're going to perform. But hey, I mean, shout out to Drew Smith, man. Like we've gotten to know him very well. I Bleav he's the longest tenured Met, at least the longest tenured Met pitcher on the entire staff. So good to have him back. I think if he's able to perform the way that he did at his peak as like the setup man to Edwin Diaz, the Mets are set up pretty well for 2026 bullpen wise, especially if they can get anything out of Adbert Alzolay as well, or one of the other pitchers that Stearns mentioned earlier today. I think, Chris, I don't know if you had a different thing that you wanted to cover from Stearns' press conference earlier, but I think we can pivot or segue very well into what he said about Pete and how those negotiations went, because you brought up the high AAV short-term deal versus longer-term, smaller AAV argument, I guess, or comparison. And Stearns today was asked about, with Pete, what were some of the factors that were, creating snags? And it was the sense that maybe he wanted a longer term deal and the AAV numbers weren't exactly matching. And he mentioned that those are kind of the two biggest factors. So I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about what he said about Pete and that whole negotiation earlier today?
Yeah, I think David Stearns did his absolute best to not throw Pete Alonso under the bus. That was my read of the situation. I got the sense that David Stearns, and there was I forget who asked it. I recognized the voice when they asked it, but I forget who it was now. But somebody asked if Steve wanted Pete back and David didn't want Pete back, and did Steve override him? And David was like, no, because Pete makes us a better baseball team. And I Bleav that David is telling the truth. But I think, and again, we're playing psychologist here on the show, right? I'm reading between the lines. But my interpretation was that David Stearns felt very comfortable letting Pete Alonso try to figure this out someplace else. That David Stearns was like, fine. Because there was this kind of tongue-in-cheek comment of like, listen, when you get to free agency, you get the opportunity to explore your market, and the market tells you what you're worth. And I thought that was David Stearns kind of saying like, this was Pete's bet. Pete made the bet, and this is where it landed. Like, this kind of falls on Pete. I think he presented it in a nice way to not throw Pete under the bus, because I do think they're happy to have Pete back. But at the end of the day, David Stearns was very comfortable letting Pete Alonso walk if the numbers didn't make sense. And I think Steve Cohen was the same way. Steve doesn't say what he says at Amazing Day if he doesn't agree with that philosophy. If he doesn't agree with, like, listen, if the math doesn't work here, we're not doing this. We're not going to carry a $330 million payroll and pay Pete the money that he wants if it doesn't make sense for us structurally. And if you don't think, based on what I just said about the pitchers and having 2-year deals with club options and having guys rehab and then be available for next year, if you don't think David Stearns, I think somewhere in his office on a Google Drive or on a OneDrive or on an Excel spreadsheet somewhere has what he thinks the 2027 or 2028 New York Mets are going to look like. Like that's how far it. So he's thinking 2, 3, 4 years ahead in the way that he's planning. So if it didn't work with Pete numbers wise, they were going to move on. They are very comfortable in their projections for this team long term. So I think he very nicely tried to put a bow on all of this, to try to put it in the rearview mirror and say, listen, Pete's here. Pete's going to help us. He would not take the bait on, is Pete more motivated now to prove it again, to kind of stick it to the Mets? He didn't take the bait on that question. He said that Pete's always motivated, that Pete wants to win a World Series. He's a competitor. Listen, David Stearns handles himself, and it's nice to have an adult in the room that is your president of baseball operations. Like I'm never concerned about David Stearns saying something stupid or foolish that he's going to have to walk back days later. He is very calculated. He's political science major at Harvard. Like, dude is smart. Dude knows how to command a room, knows how to answer these questions. I thought he handled all of the tough Pete angles that people were digging for very well. I also thought it was very telling because somebody asked him the internal projections that he had for this year, and he would not give up what he thinks this team's going to be this year. But the way that he smiled and he answered it makes me think that they think the sky's the limit for this team this year. But he also said something very telling because he said he wouldn't compare last year to this year, but he slipped up a little bit because he said that he feels more comfortable with the rotation this year than he did last year. And that's saying something. Think about what David Stearns is saying. He's saying he has more confidence in converting Clay Holmes, in turning Frankie Montas around, in Kodai Senga being healthy, in Sean Manaea proving that second half was not a fluke. He's a bigger believer in that than he was Luis Severino, the original Sean Manaea deal, David Peterson, Kodai Senga. He is more confident in this group than he is in last year's group. And listen, it's his job to project confidence, but that was really telling for me, one of my other big takeaways.
I mean, last year was such a huge, it's so easy to have that kind of vote of confidence in Jeremy Hefner in the pitching development side of things at the major league level after last year. You have to remember that going into last year, there were just as many questions about the rotation. Luis Severino and Sean Manaea and David Peterson. Senga we knew was going to be the ace, but in the wake of Scherzer leaving and Verlander leaving, DeGrom a couple years before, like, we were not sure if this rotation was going to be able to work out. Sean Manaea had not succeeded long-term as a starter after returning to the rotation from a few years in the bullpen. Luis Severino hadn't thrown over 100 innings in 2 or 3 seasons. There were big questions. Jose Quintana, what was he going to look like another year older? And these were all guys that stepped up when they needed to. And we saw how throughout as the year progressed, they got better. They made tiny adjustments. Sean Manaea looked like a completely different pitcher in the middle of the year. And it earned him a bigger, longer-term contract with the Mets as a result. So it is very easy to have that kind of vote of confidence in the pitching staff now because we know what they were able to do with some similar question marks last year. Obviously, we're going to have to see what Clay Holmes looks like as a starter, right?
I've seen the videos. Already. I am all the way in. This is what spring training does. The spring training gets you excited, and so we're buying directly into the hype. But those videos of Clay Holmes today, I'm all the way in.
If David Stearns says he's good with what Clay Holmes looked like as a starter, for instance, if he's good with Sean Manaea, obviously the contract is in itself a vote of confidence that he believes, and the Mets believe that he can be that pitcher that he was for the whole second half of 2024 for a full season. They believe in David Peterson and the strides he took last year. They believe in Kodai Senga returning from injury. To shout out Carlos Mendoza and his 5 electric innings of Kodai Senga that we got last year comment. And Chris, we will always have that win.
We will always have that brave start. I have said this from day one. You can never take that away from us from last year. Can't do it.
Exactly. So, I mean, it feels good to know that as many question marks as we may have about this staff, if you look at last year and you look at David Stearns' comments today, there is a clear vision for the 2025 rotation and even into the future. In Stearns, we trust. There's been something we've been saying for a long time, and it's even more true today.
Yeah, this is a pro David Stearns podcast. I mean, I think we've made that very clear in the way that we've discussed, but there's also this projection, and it doesn't feel phony. It doesn't feel fake, but there's this projection of confidence, right? And you hear it in the way Carlos Mendoza talks. You hear it in the way David Stearns talks. And listen, we've been around the block. I watched Brody Van Wagenen give press conferences. Okay. I watched Billy Epler give press conferences. Sandy Alderson. We have been around the block with general managers, Omar Minaya. I have never felt a level of confidence in the decision-making process than I do right now with Steve Cohen, with David Stearns, and with Carlos Mendoza. Do you feel like the concept Carlos Mendoza exudes in a press conference? Did you ever feel that way about Mickey Callaway? Did you ever feel that way about Luis Rojas? Did you ever feel that way about Buck Showalter, Terry Collins? Listen, I love Terry. Took the team to the World Series. Buck won 100 games. Listen, those guys are great. I never felt this projection of confidence and believed it the way that I do right now. And it's just because you can tell there's a unified vision. You can tell everybody is rowing the boat in the same direction, and it's paying off. And it's very easy to have a rosy view of if Sean Manaea is second half Sean Manaea all year, if Kodai Senga is healthy and looks like he did in that one Brave start, if Frankie Montas just finds a little something, if the Clay Holmes project works on a 1 to 10 scale, works like a 6 out of 10, doesn't even have to be an 8 or 9 out of 10, works a 6 out of 10. If David Peterson is just the guy that he was last year, that rotation is going to keep them in the mix in the National League East. And I don't think I'm projecting. Now, I have concerns about all of it, right? And we've said those concerns here on the show, but there is a projection of confidence that you hear up and down this organization, and you hear it from the players, coaches across the board that just, I'm ready to go. Like, I am excited. Jose Budo, reliever, not being stretched out to be a starter.
Yep.
So that's a good thing. He's going to probably be in the mix for one of those last setup roles, right? It's going to be Edwin Diaz and AJ Minter closing things down most nights, and Minter will be the setup man. And then you're going to have some combination of Ryan Stanek, Reed Garrett, and Jose Budo that are probably going to be that seventh inning guy and help bridge the gap. And so it's nice to have all these options. Like, the trust tree will return at the beginning of the year.
I hope Ryan Stanek looks like postseason Ryan Stanek for the trust season.
He is. We do this pretty regularly. I believe going into the year, Edwin Diaz and Ryan Stanek are the only two official members of the trust tree. We'll get there. Yeah. Or do we maybe wipe the slate clean and put everybody on the trust tree and you work yourself off the trust tree? I don't know. I think we can decide on that.
I think we have to start as you're on the trust tree until you prove that you don't deserve.
So that means Danny Young and Griffin Canning, who are both members of the projected Mets bullpen, they're on the trust tree. You want to put Danny Young and Griffin Canning on the trust tree?
In Stearns, we trust, man.
Okay.
Those are players that he brought in, and he's confident in them. Okay. I'm confident in them. I can sign on board with those guys being a member of the trust tree. As long as we're consistent in our approach, that's fine. Yeah. So we just wanted to bring you an episode here recapping some of the late rumblings. Spring training starting. The videos are getting released, and there's going to be more news just flurrying out here as we get closer and closer to actual games and then the beginning of the year. If you haven't seen the Clay Holmes live batting practice videos from today,
beautiful.
They are a sight to behold. And I don't want to call out Jesse Winker, but he had some bad looking swings against some of Clay Holmes.
No, don't do that. Don't throw Jesse Winker under the bus like that.
Sorry, Jesse Winker. But I also will say it was good to see Ronnie Mauricio taking batting practice as part of that session. It was good to have some knowledge of proof of life, if you will, that Ronnie Mauricio might be a contributing factor, maybe not on the opening day roster, but certainly trending towards being able to play.
And this is how we'll wrap a bow on this, because Stearns was asked specifically about bringing Jose Iglesias back. And I think the comment that he made is in line with this organizational thinking. They need to keep roster spots open and to keep the flexibility, because there's a decent chance. I don't know what the 26-man will look like. And maybe we'll do an episode here coming up where we give our projections for what the 26-man rotation will be. But there's a decent chance that Brett Baty and Ronnie Mauricio are sitting in AAA just waiting, just like ready to go. And so if you have a Jose Iglesias on the roster, you can't give Brett Baty at bats. You can't give Ronnie Mauricio at bats. And so I think long-term, big picture for the Mets, it's more important that Brett Baty and Ronnie Mauricio get those at-bats rather than Jose Iglesias gets those at-bats. As much as I love Candelita, as much as I love OMG, as much as he is part of the New York Mets lore, Grimace, and all of it, right? Also, real quick, and I don't want to spoil the Pablo Torre thing, please go watch it, but David Stearns not understanding Grimace was my favorite part of the whole thing. Like, he still didn't understand it while doing the podcast. He didn't get it. It was incredible.
It was such a joy to watch.
It was very good. So highly recommend that. But yeah, they want to keep these spots open because, I mean, we talked about Clifford and Gilbert and Acuna and Mauricio and Baty. Like, they have a roster logjam. And David Stearns admitted, he's like, we kind of operated not the way I want us to operate when it came to this roster. We kind of locked ourselves in at times, and that's kind of not the way I want to do things. And so feels like a reversion back to the way he wants this roster to operate, with the flexibility of moving guys in and out and constantly having different options at different positions. And so we'll see. I think second base could be up for grabs for these guys. I think, if Jesse Winker has a tough spring and somebody has a really good spring at third base, Vientos could go be your DH, right? There are different ways that this could pan out here over the course of spring. So we'll keep an eye on it. But that's going to do it for us here on this edition of the Bleav in Mets podcast. Make sure you rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching us on the YouTube side of things, hit that like button, please. Helps us out a ton, puts it into the algorithm, and creates this fantastic Mets community. We continue to grow it here on the pod. We'll be back with another episode later this week. And as always, let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets.